Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, an architect at Winelect, and today we're going to be looking at advanced configurations with virtual networks on Microsoft Azure. So for today, we're going to do an extended demo where we're going to take an Azure VNet, and then we're going to take an Azure VNet and create on it two subnets, a front-end subnet and a back-end subnet. And then we're going to add to that subnet, that front-end and back-end subnet, a virtual appliance that acts as a bridge between them. And then we're going to add a back-end VM to that back-end subnet so that it can connect to the internet by way of a virtual appliance that's serving as a firewall/router between that backend subnet and the front end subnet. The reason I want to do this demo is to show you how you can use Azure VNets and how you can use some of the more advanced configuration options on Azure to create more complex network scenarios than you would get with an out-of-the-box experience on something like just a virtual machine, or if you were just creating a virtual network and taking some of the default options for like network security groups and those kinds of things. So for this demo, we're going to be working through what it takes to create a virtual network from scratch, and then we're going to configure this virtual network to utilize a virtual appliance. And that's kind of the working example we'll be working with today, is deploying a virtual appliance to a virtual network, but it will expose a lot of the more advanced features on virtual networks on Azure that you probably wouldn't otherwise use if you were just deploying something like a simple VM. So what I have here is an empty resource group. So I'm going to add a resource to this, and it's going to be just the baseline VNet or virtual network on Azure. And this resource deploys rather quickly since it's just a empty virtual network. And in the configuration of this, I can give it a name. So I'm going to call it my VNet and just call it that. And then you take the defaults on this address space. So that's using about 65,000 addresses. So it's a /16 address. So the first two octets are the network portion. The last two are the host portion. And that will give me a lot of address spaces, more than I need for this demo in any case. And I can pick a resource subscription and a resource group. And then for this one, I'm going to select VNet demo and take the defaults on a lot of these. But I'm going to create a subnet, the initial subnet. I'm going to call it front end here because this is going to be my front end subnet, and I'm just going to take this first address range of 10.1.0.0/24 for the address range on my front end subnet. I'm going to add another subnet later on, but in any case, I want to take that as my first subnet, but for this deployment, I'm actually going to have two subnets. So let's go ahead and create this resource and come back whenever it finishes creating. So I'm back in my resource group now on the Azure portal, and I have my VNet created here. And I can come into here and I can see the overview tab, and you can see here that it's created with that address space I defined whenever I created this resource. And then I can come down here and look at the subnets, and there's that front end subnet that I defined whenever I created this resource. But because I want two subnets here, I'm going to go ahead and add in my second subnet, but I'm going to call it my backend subnet, because this is the one that all of my backend VNets would, all my backend virtual machines would connect to, that are going to be guarded by my virtual appliance that I'm going to be deploying to this network. And I'm going to take this CIDR block for this address range for the subnet, and then I'm going to associate with it later on a route table. But let's go ahead and create this now and get this going. So that shouldn't take too long to create. Now that I have this created, a front end and back end, I'm going to come back to my resource group, and I'm going to create two network cards, and I'm going to later join these to a virtual machine on Azure. So network interface, there it is. I'm going to create this, and I'm going to choose this, maybe my front end -Nick here, and I want to put this on my VNet, and I want to put this on my front end subnet. And my private IP address can be static for this particular one. That's fine. I don't need a network security group defined per se. I might actually add one of these later, but for now I'm going to leave it like that. And I'm going to go ahead and put it into that same resource group that I deployed my VNet into. So I'm going to create this particular network interface card, and then I'm going to add another one to it as well. And so let's come back over here to my resource group, and let's go ahead and add a second one. And this one I'm going to say network interface, and then create this. And I'm going to again select the same VNet, but this one I'm going to assign to the back end, and I'm going to call this one my back end NIC. And I want to assign a static IP address to this to reserve it, because this is the one that all of my traffic is going to be forwarded to from any virtual machine that is on my backend subnet. So I want all my traffic to flow through my virtual appliance. So I'm going to give it a private IP address of 10.1.1.4, which would be the first available IP address in this backend subnet on Azure. And I don't need a network security group, and I'm going to put it in the same resource group as my other resources, and then go ahead and click create and let this deploy. Now I'm back inside of my resource group. I'm going to go ahead and add another resource to this, and I'm going to add in a route table. I'm going to be using this route table to define routes for my backend subnet so that I can force all of the traffic through my virtual appliance. And so what I need to do that to make this work, I'm just going to call it backend route, and put it into the same resource group that everything else is going into. And virtual network gateway route propagation would be fine there. And I'm going to click create and let that create, and we'll come back when that's finished. Now I'm back in the Azure portal and back in my resource group. I'm going to come back into my route table and configure this guy to force routes through my NIC card that I have created so that everything gets routed through that NIC card. So with this in mind, I need to come down here to routes, and I'm going to click routes, add a route here. I'm going to call it internet. And it's basically just going to be a catch-all rule for this route table. So anything that isn't on the subnet gets forced through this NIC card. So basically it's just saying anything that is not locally bound to any VM on my network card gets routed through my my virtual gateway here. So to do that, I'm going to say go through a virtual appliance, and I'm going to put in the actual IP address of that. So it was 10.1.1.4, and I'm going to save that, and that route should show up here in just a second. And then I'm going to go ahead and associate this with my VNet here that I've created, and then I'm going to put it on my back end subnet so that all of my virtual machines on this particular subnet will end up getting this route that I've defined here added to their local route tables. And so essentially it will just force everything to that IP address, which, as if you recall, is the IP address that I assigned to this backend NIC here. So essentially it's going to make sure everything is routed through my virtual appliance. While I'm here inside of my network configuration, I need to enable IP forwarding on my NICs. So I'm going to do that on both my backend NIC and my front-end NIC, so that actual IP traffic can be routed through these network interface cards. So now that I have my NICs defined, I have my route table defined, I can come back over to my virtual network and configure one other setting that I want to turn on for this, and that is DNS servers. So with the DNS server, I want to customize the DNS that is added to this network here. So to do that, I'm going to enter in the IP address of my virtual appliance, which would be 10.1.1.4. And the reason why is I want all of my virtual machines that are on this VNet to resolve against this IP address, because I can use my virtual appliance as my DNS server, and I can apply rules to that those DNS entries, as well as do custom DNS entries as well, using my virtual appliance. So I'm going to save this, and that will then force all of my virtual machines on this particular VNet to use that as the DNS server. Okay, so with that in mind, I think I have everything in place to go ahead and create the virtual machine that I need to serve as my virtual appliance. Okay, now I'm back in my resource group, and I'm going to go ahead and add in the virtual appliance that I want to use. I'm going to deploy Untangle. Untangle is a next-gen firewall that is representative of most virtual appliances that you might deploy in Azure. It provides some additional network features that you might not be able to get out of something like a basic network security group. It does things like intrusion detection. It does virus detection. It does a lot of things related to protocol and application. Stateful packet inspection is what that's called. You can also do the same kind of packet filtering that you would with a network security group as well. And I can also use it for VPN endpoint as well. So it does a lot of that kind of stuff, but I'm just using it as a representation of what you could use a virtual appliance for on Azure. So let's go ahead and create this guy. I'm going to put it in the same resource group as the rest of the resources I created. I'm going to call the VM Untangle. And I'm going to basically take the defaults on all the availability. And then I'm going to choose a B2MS here for the size, because I don't really need, that's actually too big. Actually, I could go with a B2S here, which is 2 cores, 4 gigs, which is more than enough to run this firewall. And then I'm going to punch in a username and password for administration. And I can definitely change these later on. I'm going to select inbound ports. This doesn't really matter since I'm going to be turning off this stuff anyway. And I'm going to select standard HDD since it's mostly just using that for logs. And then this virtual network is fine. I want to use, no, it's not the one I want. I want to use the existing network. So I need to put this in the correct region in order to use the correct network. So let's go back to networking now. That's the networking I want. Public IP address and so on, I'm going to leave as is. I'm going to turn off all this NIC network security group and so on, because I'm actually going to be deleting the public IP address and the virtual network card that it creates. Probably keep the public IP address, but deleting the default NIC that it creates for this machine, because I want to use the one I've already created, because I configured it more manually and it has the settings already. So let's go ahead and create this guy and then come back whenever it finishes. I'm in my resource group, and here's the virtual appliance I created. It's a virtual machine, and I want to use the NIC card that I've already created. So to do that, for the front end, I need to come back over here and attach a network interface card. I'm going to select my front end NIC here and go ahead and attach this to this virtual machine. Now this will take a few minutes to do, but once I'm done, I can then remove the one it created when I created the virtual machine. So the first thing I need to do this one is detach this network interface, and then I'm going to attach my backend NIC once this one detaches. And to do this on a virtual machine on Azure, you need to have the virtual machine powered down so that you can allocate and reallocate NICs to the virtual machine. And then I'm going to associate that backend NIC with it. So then I'll have my front end and my backend NIC associated with it. Now on some virtual machines, you can have more than 2 NIC cards. And then some virtual appliances will have a third NIC, and they might call it a management NIC. And it's just a third network interface that allows only for network management interfaces for configuring the virtual appliance. But for Untangle, it can piggyback on either the front end or the back end NIC for things like administration and so on. But now that I have these two attached to this virtual machine, I can come back over here to my resource group, and I can remove this, disassociate this public IP address from the NIC, and then reassociate it with the other front-end NIC that I created. And then I'm going to remove this network interface card from the virtual machine. Now that that IP has been disassociated with the network interface that was created by default, I can come back in here and choose my front-end NIC for that public IP address. And I can then come back over here to this network interface card that I'm no longer in need of and delete it. So we've just basically shuffled around a couple of network interface cards that I wanted to use the one I created when I created the VNet rather than the one I created by default when I created the virtual machine on Azure. And once all that's done, I have two NICs on my virtual machine that are front end and back end NIC that are associated with the subnets that I have on my virtual network. Now that I have that ready to go, I can come back into my virtual machine here and power this guy up. And this guy will, but first, before I connect to it, I need to start it. And it'll take a few minutes for this to boot. So when it's booted, we'll come back and take a look at my virtual appliance on Azure. So here I am looking at my virtual machine overview, and I have my public IP address and my private IP address associated with this guy. So if I take this public IP address and I go to a new browser tab, I'm going to be able to look at Untangle. I've already logged into Untangle here, and this is what its admin interface looks like. Now, every virtual appliance is going to look somewhat different from what you see here. And this is just what the Untangle virtual appliance looks like. But I want to show you where this is configured to use the underlying infrastructure that we created on Azure. So here I have my external and internal interfaces, and these are associated with those NIC cards that I created. So there's the public facing IP address, and there's the backend IP address for this particular virtual appliance. So if I was to create a virtual appliance in Azure, it would use something like this. And then other virtual machines then would pick up an address on the backend subnet and then force their traffic through this particular IP address. So let's go ahead and create another virtual machine and see what it looks like on its IP configuration and see if I can get through the internet using this virtual appliance. So what I have here is the actual dashboard for my Untangle appliance, my virtual appliance that I deployed. And notice it has a known device. It's got some devices that have been connected to it, and that's really the Ubuntu virtual machine that I have behind this. So to connect to this guy, what I did is I SSH'd into my virtual appliance, and then from there I jumped over to my virtual machine. So I'm actually connected to this by way of the virtual appliance. Now to verify that this is actually working, I can use the ping command, simply just ping google.com, and if everything is working fine, I should get replies back, and I am from that particular address. Now to verify that everything is working according to plan, and that's not going out through some other route, I can do a trace route. And the trace route is a utility that shows me all the hops it will take along the way to get to the final destination. Now, part of this will be blocked by my virtual appliance, but the first hop in any case should be my virtual appliance, which in this case is Untangle. You can see that it's doing that right there. And this is unable to resolve some of the names for it, but as it resolves additional hops along the way, because of the virtual appliance is blocking that. But in any case, I am able to hit that first hop, which is my virtual appliance IP address, and that's the backend IP address for it, and then the front end IP would be 10.1.0.4. So you can see here that everything is working according to plan for this virtual appliance and how it's working as a router for virtual machines behind it. Well, this was going to wrap up our demo for today on configuring virtual networks and how you can use virtual networks to configure something like a virtual appliance or any number of other complex configurations for networking on Azure. So you can do all kinds of things with virtual networks, and this is one of the canonical examples. If you don't want to use some of the basic firewall features available on Azure, like network security groups, you can deploy your own virtual appliances and use those to connect to the internet. So thanks for watching this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintellect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintellect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintellect on Twitter at WintellectNow or at Wintellect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintellect.com. Until next time, thank you.